Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 106. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 90 and 91 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the essence of law and of the various kinds of law. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. And because today we begin a new section on law, it's worth beginning with Aquinas' introduction to this section. He writes, "We have now to consider the extrinsic principles of acts. Now the extrinsic principle inclining to evil is the devil, of whose temptations we have spoken, but the extrinsic principle moving to good is God, who both instructs us by means of his law and assists us by his grace. Wherefore, in the first place, we must speak of law, in the second place, of grace." And so here we go on law. Article 1, whether law is something pertaining to reason. A law stems from reason because it stems from our knowledge of both the first principle of practical reason, that the good ought to be done and evil avoided, plus our particular judgment on what is in fact good or evil for us, not only in general, but also at this particular moment for us to do. This is what we mean by the law of conscience, for example. And using conscience as an example of law, conscience is, as we discussed in episode 41, in St. Thomas's words, according to the very nature of the word, it implies the relation of knowledge to something, for conscience may be resolved into cum alio scientia, i.e., knowledge applied to an individual case. But the application of knowledge to something is done by some act. Wherefore, from this explanation of the name, it is clear that conscience is an act, and it is the law of our intellect, for it is customary for causes and effects to be called after one another. So I use conscience, or the law of conscience, as an example in response to our article because by it we experience the truth of this article, that law is something pertaining to reason, that it is indeed a kind of binding or mandate upon us stemming from the judgment of reason. Article 2, whether the law is always something directed towards the common good. And just as particular goals must find their origin and root in some ultimate goal to which they are directed, like the goal of watching movies, for example, would be directed to the goal of happiness or being happy, so too for a particular law to be in alignment with reason, for it to direct us rightly in some particular manner, it must do so in view of our ultimate good, which is happiness. Further, because man does not live alone, but comes into existence in a community, the family, thrives naturally within a community, he also achieves happiness with and through a community. Therefore, particular laws, in order to be just and beneficial, must not only direct the individual rightly in view of his ultimate end, but it must also direct the community, or the man as a member of that community. So what then exactly is the common good? It is the good pursued by all, and the goal of all, which is happiness, which law must serve as directing towards, as an aid to. In more precise words regarding the common good, here are the words of Dr. Alan Phimister, Father Thomas Crean, in their seminal and relatively recent book, Integralism. These authors write, "A common good is a good which can be shared entirely by several persons. Hence the notion of common good applies directly to spiritual things, such as truth or beauty, which of their nature may be possessed by many without diminution. It is because a common good is not diminished by being participated in by more than one person that it can be the end of a society." Or as St. Thomas writes in this article, since every part is ordained to the whole, as imperfect to perfect, and since one man is a part of the perfection of a community, the law must necessarily regard properly the relationship to universal happiness. Wherefore the philosopher in the above definition of legal matters mentions both happiness and the body politic. For he says that we call those legal matters just, which are adapted to produce and preserve happiness and its parts for the body politic, since the state is a perfect community. Article 3, whether the reason of any man is competent to make laws. Does every individual within a society have the right to enact laws? And thank God this is not the case. And a word from St. Thomas, the making of a law belongs either to the whole people or to a public personage who has care of the whole people, since in all other matters the directing of anything to the end concerns him to whom the end belongs. So normally speaking, it is the head of a city or the state who has the obligation to direct all towards their end, and thereby also has the right to enact laws to such purpose. Although the people at large could also come to a consensus on some matter, which is why the phrase, the whole people, is also included in St. Thomas's response here. Article 4, whether promulgation is essential to a law. For a law to direct a people, to be binding upon that people, must be made known to them, which is this article's question. Is promulgation essential to law? St. Thomas's response, in order that a law obtain the binding force, which is proper to law, it must needs be applied to the men who have to be ruled by it. Such application is made by it being notified to them by promulgation, wherefore promulgation is necessary for the law to obtain its force. Therefore, based on the following articles, and to conclude this question 90, we receive at the end of it from St. Thomas the definition of law, which is nothing else than an ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. And with that, we move on to question 91 of the various kinds of law. Article 1, whether there is an eternal law. St. Thomas's response, which is succinct and straightforward, so we will simply quote him. He writes, a law is nothing else but a dictate of practical reason emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community. Now it is evident that the world is ruled by divine providence. The very idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. And since the divine reason's conception of things is not subject to time but is eternal, therefore it is that his kind of law must be called eternal. Article 2, whether there is in us a natural law. First, beginning with the definition of natural law as given by St. Thomas, he writes, the natural law is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. In other words, the natural law is our knowledge of the eternal law, as knowable or accessible to us by the natural light of reason. For example, it is by the natural law that we know mankind is male and female, that any sexual act that is not essentially procreative is wrong, that drunkenness is wrong, that abortion is wrong, and so on. These are known by common sense, which is our participation naturally in the eternal law, the knowledge of God regarding how things are and how things ought to conduct themselves, based on what they are. Article 3, whether there is a human law. We see human law all around us, whether it be tax law, marriage law, traffic law. More fundamental than these laws, human laws help to pin down in writing, in civil law, those things pertaining to the natural law. Like, again, that drunk driving is wrong, which one could figure out based on the nature of man alone. However, by pinning it down in writing, by making it part of civil law, these laws help us, because on this side of the fall, our race can easily err on the specific dictates of the natural law in taking certain naturally known fundamental principles and bringing them down to their necessary conclusions. Civil law helps make explicit and specific what might be murky and difficult to discern on one's own. Thus, drunk driving is against the law. And for the longest time, we had laws protecting marriage between a man and a woman. For the longest time, we had a law protecting unborn children. All of these things pertain to the natural law and were also coded at one time into human or civil law. St. Thomas says here, a law is a dictate of the practical reason. It is from the precepts of the natural law, as from general and indemonstrable principles, that the human reason needs to proceed to the more particular determination of certain matters. These particular determinations, devised by human reason, are called human laws. So human law, again, helps to direct us in the nebulous particulars while being rooted fundamentally and deriving their justification from the natural law. Article 4, whether there was any need for a divine law. And there was, because we have an ender goal which is above nature, the beatific vision, seeing God as he is. And because this end is supernatural, we require an above natural direction or law to guide us there. And this is the divine law. In St. Thomas's words, since man is ordained to an end of eternal happiness, which is in to man's natural faculty, therefore it was necessary that besides the natural and the human law, man should be directed to his end by a law given by God. The divine law is also useful in commanding a man at the depth of his own interior thoughts and his wills, which no human law could discern or enforce. Divine law can also forbid certain things that, if forbidden by human law, would lead to revolt, surely, or anarchy, or just contempt of the law. For example, the Ten Commandments can forbid adultery, and Jesus Christ in the gospel can forbid lust. But if civil law were to do these, it would likely either be impossible to enforce or lead to some kind of revolution, especially in America in our day today, sadly. So in summary, divine law is necessary for directing us to our supernatural end and is expedient to a man's perfection by commanding those things which civil law and civil authorities could never either perceive in a man or never be able to forbid, practically speaking. Article 5, whether there is but one divine law. And we actually have both the old law, the law of the old covenant, as well as the new law, the law of the new covenant instituted by Christ. These two laws differ in a way analogous. According to Aquinas, a boy differs from a man as the imperfect to the perfect. And to prove that, St. Thomas says that the old law promised temporal and sensible good, directed righteousness and external actions primarily, and it was enforced by fear. However, the new law promises eternal and immaterial good, directs man to the righteousness of the heart, and is enforced or motivated by love. In a word, in contrasting these two laws, St. Thomas concludes, as the father of a family issues different commands to the children and to the adults, so also the one king God in his one kingdom gave one law to men while they were yet imperfect, and another more perfect law when, by the preceding law, they had been led to a greater capacity for divine things. Article 6, our last article, whether there is a law in the foams of sin. We pick up this notion from Scripture. St. Paul writes in Romans chapter 7, I see another law in my members fighting against the law of my mind. What do we mean by this law against the law of the mind? St. Thomas writes, accordingly, under the divine lawgiver, various creatures have various natural inclinations, so that what is, as it were, a law for one is against the law for another. Thus I might say that fierceness is, in a way, the law of a dog, but against the law of a sheep or another meek animal. And so the law of man, which by divine ordinance is allotted to him, according to his proper natural condition, is that he should act in accordance with reason. And this law was so effective in the primitive state that nothing either beside or against reason could take man unawares. But when man turned his back on God, he fell under the influence of his sensual impulses. So that is what we mean by a law in a person's members, which is at war with his mind. It is the sensual appetites or passions which simply follow sensual apprehension, and insofar as they may be inclined to that which reason forbids, They are a law unto themselves and at odds with the law of the mind. And that is all for another episode. We have just finished covering questions 90 and 91 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the essence of law and of the various kinds of law. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.